When a lonely billionaire's autistic son speaks his first word to the housemaid, hearts awaken, pasts collide, and love finds its way into the most unexpected places. Ethan Cole was one of the richest men in the country. People called him a genius. He built a tech company from nothing and turned it into a billion-dollar empire. His face appeared in magazines, newspapers, and business shows. He had everything. People dream about money, power, fame, but inside, Ethan felt empty. His huge mansion in Los Angeles was silent, cold, and lonely. Expensive furniture, tall glass windows, and shiny floors couldn't hide the truth. This wasn't a home. It was just a quiet building filled with sadness. Ethan wasn't always like this. Years ago, he was full of life. He laughed, danced in the rain with his wife Amanda, and read bedtime stories to his little son Jacob. Amanda was the light of his life. She was kind, funny, and always made their house feel warm. When Amanda died in a car crash 3 years ago, everything changed. Ethan stopped smiling. He stopped caring. He became colder, quieter, and distant. Work became his escape. He worked all day and stayed at his office late into the night. Told himself it was for Jacob to build a future. For his son, but the truth was, he didn't know how to face the pain. Jacob was only 3 when his mother died. He was a sweet little boy with curly brown hair and big eyes. But he was different. He didn't talk much, didn't play like other kids, and often stared at things for hours. The doctors said Jacob had autism. He was nonverbal and needed special care. Ethan loved his son deeply, but he didn't know how to connect with him. He hired therapists, doctors, and nannies, expensive ones, but none stayed for long. Jacob would scream, cry, or hide under the furniture. He hated loud sounds, new people, and unexpected changes. Many staff members left after a few weeks. Some even left in tears. The mansion felt more like a hospital than a home. There were security guards, cleaning staff, and personal chefs. No one gave Jacob the love he needed. Ethan watched his son from a distance, like a stranger. He didn't know how to hold him, how to comfort him, or even how to speak to him. Sometimes he stood outside Jacob's room at night, listening to his soft whimpers and feeling completely helpless. Then one morning, Grace arrived. She was a tall, strong black woman in her 40s with calm eyes and a quiet strength. Her hair was tied up and her clothes were simple. Grace didn't come from a fancy agency. She wasn't a trained therapist or a celebrity nanny. She was just a maid, hired to clean rooms and do laundry. She had taken the job because she needed money for her own family, her daughter and grandchild back in Atlanta. She had seen hard times, worked hard jobs, and lived through pain. But she carried herself with quiet dignity. No one paid her much attention when she started. In big houses like this, new staff were just background noise. Grace moved silently, cleaning rooms, folding clothes, wiping counters. But unlike others, she noticed things. She noticed how Jacob always held a toy car in his hand. She noticed how he flinched when people spoke loudly. And she noticed how Ethan's eyes were full of sadness, even when he smiled for cameras. One day something happened that changed everything. It was late afternoon. The nanny was supposed to watch Jacob, but she had gone to take a phone call. Grace was dusting the hallway when she heard a loud thump followed by crying. She rushed to the living room and found Jacob on the floor, rocking back and forth, hitting his head with his hands. His face was red and he was shaking. A loud cartoon had started playing on the TV by accident, and the sound had frightened him. No one else was around. Grace didn't think. She dropped her cloth, knelt beside him, and started humming. It wasn't a song from a movie or the radio. It was a lullaby, an old, soft tune her grandmother used to sing to her when she was scared. Her voice was low and warm like honey. Jacob didn't stop crying at once, but his rocking slowed. His hands dropped to his lap, and then he looked at her. Their eyes met. It was just a few seconds. But something passed between them, something powerful and gentle. Grace slowly reached out and touched his hand. He didn't pull away. She sat beside him, still humming, her arm around his tiny shoulders. After a while, Jacob leaned into her. When the nanny returned, she was shocked to see Jacob sitting quietly beside Grace, holding her hand. She stammered, unsure what to say. Grace stood up calmly and said he just needed someone to see him. That night, the nanny told Ethan what had happened. Ethan didn't react, simply nodded and went back to his work. But the next day, he stayed home instead of going to the office. He waited, and sure enough, in the afternoon he heard the familiar sound of humming. He walked quietly to the playroom and peeked through the half-open door. Grace was sitting on the floor with Jacob, building a tower of blocks. She didn't talk much. She just smiled and handed him the pieces. Jacob, for the first time, wasn't frustrated or angry. He giggled when the tower fell and clapped his hands. Grace clapped too, and they laughed together. Ethan stood there, frozen. It was the first time he had heard his son laugh in years. Over the next few weeks, something changed. Jacob began following Grace around the house. He waited for her in the kitchen. He brought her toys. He sat beside her when she folded laundry. Grace didn't treat him like a problem or a project. She treated him like a person. She sang to him, baked muffins with him, and even taught him how to water the garden. She didn't force him to speak or behave. She just let him be. Ethan noticed. He started coming home earlier. At first he said it was to check on Jacob's progress, but in truth he wanted to watch. He sat in the background, pretending to read emails. But he was watching them, Jacob's small smile, Grace's patient hands, their peaceful connection. Something in Ethan's heart stirred. He couldn't explain it. It was like watching a sunrise after years of darkness. One evening there was a thunderstorm. Jacob hated storms. The loud thunder scared him deeply. The lights flickered and Jacob began crying and screaming. The nanny panicked and tried to call the therapist, but Grace didn't wait. She ran to Jacob's room, wrapped him in a blanket, and sat with him on the rocking chair. She rocked him gently, whispering, "You're safe, baby."
I got you.
Ethan stood outside the room, listening. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He didn't even realize he was crying. He had spent millions on therapists, but no one had ever calmed Jacob like that. No one had ever held him like a mother. And in that moment, Ethan saw Grace not as a maid, not as staff, but as something much more. He saw her heart. And something inside his own heart cracked open. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen long after midnight, thinking about everything: Amanda's death, Jacob's pain, his own failures. He remembered how he had locked his feelings away, thinking it made him strong. But now, watching Grace with his son, he realized strength looked different. It looked like kindness, patience, love. The next morning, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He made breakfast. It was a disaster. He burned the eggs, spilled the juice, and dropped a fork. But when Grace walked in and saw him trying, she smiled, really smiled. Jacob toddled in behind her, looked at the mess, and laughed. And somehow, that laugh felt like the most beautiful sound in the world. From that day forward, Ethan began to change. He started sitting with Jacob during story time. He asked Grace how to bake cookies. He joined them during afternoon walks. Slowly, the walls around his heart began to fall. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of something he never expected. A second chance. Not just at being a father. Grace had now worked in Ethan's mansion for a few weeks, and slowly, something quiet but powerful had begun to grow. It wasn't something anyone talked about. There were no big announcements or sudden changes. It was there in the way. Jacob waited for Grace near the staircase every morning. In the way he followed her footsteps, like a little shadow, and in the calmness that now lived in his eyes. The other staff noticed it too. Jacob, who once used to scream and hide, now sat on the floor playing with wooden puzzles. He didn't speak yet, but he was showing signs. He would clap when Grace sang to him, would nod or shake his head when asked simple questions. He would touch her arm lightly when he wanted her attention. No one could understand how it happened. Doctors had tried. Therapists had tried. But Grace, with no official training, had done what no one else could. Grace never made a big deal out of it. She treated Jacob like a normal child. She gave him time. She gave him silence when he needed it, and comfort when he asked for it in his own quiet ways. She didn't push. She didn't judge. She simply loved him like a son. One afternoon, Jacob was upset. Something had changed in his routine. Different breakfast cereal. A new face among the staff, and he didn't like it. He was rocking in the corner of the living room, holding his small toy car tightly, humming in his own way. The other maid stood at a distance, unsure what to do. Grace walked in, knelt down, and whispered gently, "Want to listen to our song?" She didn't wait for an answer. She began to hum that same soft tune, the old lullaby. Slowly, Jacob crawled into her lap and buried his face in her chest. Grace rocked him gently, rubbing his back. That was when Ethan walked in. He had come home earlier than usual. He had just closed a big deal and had been on the phone all morning. But when he saw Grace and Jacob like that, the phone slipped from his hand. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Something about the way Grace held his son, the way her strong arms made him feel safe, hit Ethan hard. It reminded him of Amanda. That evening, Ethan didn't return to his home office like he usually did. Instead, he stayed in the kitchen. Grace came in to fix Jacob's dinner. She was surprised to see Ethan sitting there drinking tea. Do you want something to eat, sir?" she asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. "No, I wanted to thank you." Grace looked confused. "For what?" "For today. For Jacob. For everything, really." Grace smiled softly. "He's a good boy. He just needs patience." Ethan nodded. "Learning that. Spent so much time running my company, I forgot how to just be." There was silence for a moment, not awkward, but thoughtful. Ethan noticed the tired lines near Grace's eyes. She worked long hours and never complained. She didn't wear makeup or expensive clothes. But there was something strong and graceful about her that Ethan had never really seen before. From that day, their connection began to grow, not fast. Not romantic right away, but quiet and steady. They started talking more. Ethan would ask her about Jacob's favorite activities. Grace would tell him how music seemed to help him stay calm. She showed him how to use simple hand signs to talk to Jacob. Ethan tried them awkwardly, and Jacob responded with a small smile. That smile felt like a trophy to Ethan. One Saturday morning, Ethan surprised both Grace and Jacob. He came into the kitchen in jeans and a t-shirt, holding a mixing bowl. "Can I help with breakfast?" he asked. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Do you know how to cook?" Ethan grinned. "No, but I want to learn." They laughed, and Grace handed him a whisk. That morning, the kitchen smelled like pancakes and joy. Jacob watched from his seat, clapping. When Ethan dropped flour on the floor, Grace helped him stir the batter, and they all sat together at the table to eat. It was the first time in years that Ethan felt like he was part of a family again. Days turned into weeks. Jacob's bond with Grace grew stronger. He would run to her when he was scared, tug at her clothes when he was hungry, and sit close to her during thunderstorms. But something else began to grow too, something Ethan couldn't ignore. He started to notice Grace not just as Jacob's caretaker, but as a woman. He noticed how her eyes lit up when Jacob laughed, how her laugh filled the empty house, and how her presence made everything feel warmer. But he was careful. He didn't want to cross any lines. She was his employee. She had her own life. Still, he couldn't help the feeling building inside. One rainy evening, Grace stayed late because Jacob had trouble sleeping. Ethan offered to drive her home. She hesitated but agreed. On the way, they talked about her past. She told him about growing up in Georgia, about her daughter who was raising a child alone, and how she worked different jobs to help support them. Ethan listened closely. It was the longest conversation he'd had with anyone outside of work in years. When they reached her apartment, Grace turned to him and said, "Thank you for the ride, and thank you for trusting me with Jacob." Ethan looked at her. "No, thank you for saving him, and me." There was a long pause. Their eyes met. Nothing was said, but everything was felt. Grace smiled, nodded, and stepped out into the rain. Ethan watched her go, his heart pounding like it hadn't in years. Back at the mansion, the other staff began to whisper. They noticed how Ethan lingered in the kitchen when Grace was there, How he asked her opinion before making changes to Jacob's schedule. How he sometimes laughed, really laughed when talking to her. Some were supportive, others were judgmental. Few even told the head manager that it was inappropriate. Right. Ethan didn't care. One day, Jacob tried to say something, pointed at Grace, and moved his lips. It was a small sound, barely a word, but it was clear. Gah! Gah! Grace froze. Her eyes filled with tears. Did he just say? Ethan asked, standing beside her. I think he's trying to say Grace, she whispered. They both knelt beside Jacob, who smiled proudly. That moment sealed. Something unspoken between them. Ethan started spending more time at home. He left some of his business meetings to his managers. He built a small therapy space in the mansion for Jacob. He and Grace began working together, reading books on autism, attending online workshops, and creating a peaceful environment. Jacob flourished, and so did something between them. Ethan didn't make any grand moves. He was still unsure how Grace felt. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable. But the way she looked at him now, the soft smiles, the way she touched his arm when laughing, it gave him hope. One evening, while Jacob was asleep, Ethan found Grace sitting alone in the garden, watching the stars. He sat beside her. The night was cool, and the flowers swayed in the wind. Do you ever think life is trying to give us second chances? Ethan asked. Grace looked at him quietly. Maybe, but some people are too afraid to take them. Ethan took a deep breath. Been afraid for a long time. Grace turned to him. So have I. Their eyes met again. This time there was no need for silence. No fear. Only the quiet truth that something had changed. Jacob stirred in his room. The wind blew gently through the trees. And in the stillness of that moment, Ethan realized something. He wasn't just learning how to be a father again. He was falling in love with the woman who taught him how. Ethan's life had changed more in the last few months than it had in all the years before. He didn't live in the same silence anymore. The rooms that were once filled only with the sound of footsteps or distant cleaning machines were now filled with something better: Jacob's soft laughter, the sound of music playing from the kitchen, and Grace's calm, warm voice humming songs. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel cold. It felt alive. He no longer woke up just to attend meetings or build new products. He woke up to have breakfast with Jacob, to ask Grace how Jacob slept, and sometimes even to try flipping pancakes, though he often failed, but Grace would laugh and guide him. Jacob would giggle, watching his father burn toast or spill flour. And in those small, simple moments, Ethan found something he hadn't had in a long time: peace. Every day, his heart grew warmer toward Grace at first. It had been admiration watching her connect with his son in ways he couldn't. Then it turned to respect, learning about her strength, her struggles, and the quiet dignity she carried. But now, it was something else. He found himself looking for her, wanting to be around her. He liked the way she tucked Jacob's blanket, the way she smiled when she thought no one was watching, and how her hands moved with such care even when she was just folding laundry. But Ethan didn't know how to express these feelings. He was scared. This wasn't a normal situation. She worked for him. She came from a completely different world. What if she didn't feel the same? What if he made things uncomfortable? So he kept quiet. He simply stayed close, helping more, listening more, smiling more. Grace, too, had started noticing the change. She saw how Ethan's eyes softened whenever he looked at Jacob. She saw how he tried to be more patient, more present. And she noticed how he looked at her not like a maid, not like someone hired to clean, but like a woman who mattered. She hadn't expected any of this. When she took the job, she only wanted to earn enough to help her daughter and grandchild. She had worked for wealthy people before. Most of them didn't even remember her name. But Ethan was different. He asked about her life, remembered the stories she told. He thanked her not just for doing chores, but for the little things, like helping Jacob hold a spoon or calming him during thunderstorms. Still, Grace was careful. She didn't want to imagine things. She had been hurt. Before, she had seen how people like her were judged for even hoping for something more. And Ethan, he was a billionaire. She was just the maid. One afternoon, Grace and Ethan sat in the backyard while Jacob played with his toy blocks. It was a quiet, sunny day. Ethan had brought iced tea and offered Grace a glass. She accepted, and they sat in silence for a while. "Just watching Jacob. He's really growing," Ethan said softly. Grace nodded. "Yes, he's more open now. He trusts." "It's because of you," Ethan said. Grace looked at him. "It's because someone finally saw him. Not as broken, just as different." Ethan stared at her for a moment. His heart beat faster. He wanted to tell her how he felt. But before he could speak, they heard footsteps behind them. It was Ethan's sister. Claire had come to visit unexpectedly. She was elegant, sharp, and always direct. She hugged Ethan and smiled politely at Grace, but her eyes were sharp. Later, when Grace had gone to help Jacob inside, Claire pulled Ethan aside. "Are you out of your mind?" she said. Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about, that woman? The maid. You're spending too much time with her." Ethan stiffened. "She's taking care of Jacob. She's the only one who's ever truly helped him." Claire crossed her arms. "And that's all it is? 'Cause people are talking, Ethan. The board members, your friends. You're a billionaire." "Shh. Not even in the same world." Ethan clenched his jaw. "She's kind, she's smart, and she's changed our lives. She's a worker, Ethan. What do you think this looks like? You're risking your reputation." Ethan didn't answer. But inside he felt something twist anger, guilt, and fear all mixed together. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Claire said. Was he being foolish? Would people mock Grace? Would Jacob be affected by rumors or gossip? The next day, Ethan became distant. He stopped joining Grace and Jacob in the kitchen. He stayed longer in his office. He responded with short answers when Grace spoke. Grace noticed the change immediately. She didn't ask questions. She just stepped back, but it hurt. Deeply, Jacob felt it too. He grew restless, confused by the sudden shift. He threw his toys, refused to eat, and even went back to hiding under the table. Grace tried to comfort him, but something was missing. She knew what it was. One evening, Grace found Ethan sitting alone on the patio. His face looked tired, his eyes heavy with conflict. "Mr. Cole," she said gently, "did I do something wrong?" Ethan looked up at her. His voice was quiet. "No, you've done everything right. That's the problem." Grace sat down slowly. "Then why are you pulling away?" He looked at her, pain in his eyes. "Because I'm scared." "Of what?" She whispered. "Of how I feel, of what people will say, of how the world sees us." Grace nodded slowly. "I know how the world sees me, Ethan. I've lived with it all my life. But I'm not ashamed of who I am." "Are you ashamed of how you feel?" He didn't answer. Grace stood up, holding back tears. "I came here to work, but I found something I didn't expect. I found a boy who needed love. I gave him that. Not for money, not for praise, just because he deserved it." She turned to leave, then paused. "And I gave you something too. My trust, my care. But if that's not something you want anymore, I'll pack my things tomorrow." That night, Ethan sat in Jacob's room long after he fell asleep. He held Jacob's small hand and cried silently. He remembered Grace's words. He remembered the warmth she brought into their lives. And he realized something. He had already lost one woman. He loved. He couldn't lose another because of fear. The next morning, Grace was in her room, packing her small suitcase. Her hands trembled. She didn't want to go, but she had her dignity. Just as she zipped the bag, she heard a knock at the door. It was Ethan. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept at all. In his hand, he held one of Jacob's drawings, a stick figure family. Jacob, Grace, and Ethan, all holding hands. "I can't do this without you," he said, his voice breaking. Grace stared at the picture, her eyes filled with tears. Ethan stepped closer. "I don't care what people say. I don't care what they think. You're the only person who's made this house a home. You gave Jacob love, and you gave me something I thought I'd never have again, hope." Grace didn't say anything. She stepped forward and hugged him tightly. And in that embrace, they both felt it, the pain, the fear, the love, the healing. All of it. From that day on, things changed again, but this time for the better. Ethan no longer hid his feelings. He spent more time with Grace and Jacob together. They went to the park, baked together, even watched old movies on weekends. Ethan stood up for Grace when anyone questioned her presence. He made it clear she wasn't just the help. She was family, and slowly, Grace began to believe it too. She didn't wear fancy dresses or expensive jewelry, but at dinner, she sat beside Ethan. At therapy meetings, she spoke as Jacob's guardian. And in the quiet hours of the night, when Jacob was asleep, she and Ethan sat together under the stars, holding hands. Speaking about the future, not as boss and employee, but as partners. Grace had become more than just a part of Ethan's household. She was now the heart of it. Jacob was doing better every day. Still didn't speak much, but he laughed more, slept peacefully, and showed affection in his own special ways. He hugged Ethan before bedtime. He held Grace's hand tightly when they walked in the garden. He even started drawing pictures of their small family himself. His father and Grace all holding hands under a smiling sun. Ethan had changed too. The man who once buried himself in meetings and emails now spent his mornings cooking breakfast. In his evenings helping Jacob build puzzles. His eyes were softer. His smile came more easily. His heart felt full again, and he knew the reason. It was Grace. She had brought love and healing into their lives without asking for anything in return, but outside their warm little world, people had started to notice. Some didn't like what they saw. It started with whispers from the staff. A few maids who had worked for Ethan for years began gossiping about how too close he was getting with Grace. They said things like, "She's just a maid. Why is she sitting at the dinner table?" Others rolled their eyes when they saw Ethan laughing with her or walking side by side in the garden. Some were jealous, others were just uncomfortable. But it didn't stop with gossip. Ethan's business. Partners also began to ask questions. One evening, during a board meeting, one of the senior investors pulled him aside. His name was Charles A. Rich, old man who had supported Ethan since the early days of his company. "I hear some interesting things, Ethan," Charles said with a smirk. "You're keeping very close company with your maid." Ethan's face hardened. "Her name is Grace, and she's the best thing that ever happened to my son." Charles chuckled, but his tone was sharp. "You're a billionaire. Think about your reputation, your image. Do you really want the world talking about you and the help?" Ethan stared at him, angry and disgusted. But Charles continued, "You're on the cover of business magazines. Your name is respected in every room. Don't throw it away for a woman who, let's be honest, doesn't belong in your world." Ethan left the meeting early. Couldn't sleep that night. Not because he agreed with Charles, but because he realized just how ugly people's thoughts could be. He had worked hard to build his name. But now he had something far more important, his son's happiness, and a woman who made life beautiful. Again, was he really going to let whispers and cruel words take that away? Grace had noticed the change in Ethan's mood. He was quieter that week. He still smiled, still helped with Jacob, but something heavy hung over him. Grace didn't push, but she felt it. One evening, while cleaning up the dishes, she looked at him and said, "You've been distant again. Is someone making you feel ashamed of me?" Ethan's head shot up. "What? No, never." "Then what's wrong?" Ethan sighed. "People are talking. Board members, friends. Even the staff, they think. They think we don't belong together." Grace's hands paused over the sink. Her voice was soft. "Do you think that too?" "No, not at all," he said quickly. "But I'm scared, not of being with you. Scared for you. I'm scared they'll try to tear you apart. You've done nothing but love my son and bring peace into this house. Still people treat you like you're less." Grace dried her hands and turned to face him. Her eyes were calm but firm. "I've been treated like I'm less my whole life, because I'm black, because I'm a woman, because I work with my hands. But I've never let that stop me from loving people or standing tall." She stepped closer. "If you're with me, you need to be strong. Not for me, but for Jacob, for yourself." Ethan nodded slowly. He knew she was right, but the tension didn't go away. One afternoon, Jacob had a small meltdown after a therapy session. He screamed and threw his toys. The therapist tried to calm him, but nothing worked. Grace rushed in, knelt beside him, and began humming. Slowly, Jacob calmed, crawled into her lap, and fell asleep. A new staff member, who had joined just a week earlier, stood watching with judgmental eyes. Later, she went to the house manager and complained, "I don't think it's right. That maid acts like she's his mother." The manager passed this along to Ethan softly, hesitantly, but it lit a fire inside him. That night he called a meeting with the entire house staff. "I need to say something," he said, standing in the grand living room. "Grace is not just an employee, she is family. She is the reason my son is smiling again. If anyone has a problem with that, you don't belong in this house." Everyone went silent. Some staff nodded respectfully, others lowered their heads. A few exchanged nervous looks, but no one said a word. Grace heard about the meeting the next day. She was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at Ethan and said, "That was brave." "I should have done it sooner," Ethan said. "I won't let anyone make you feel small. In your own home?" But the hardest challenge was still coming. One weekend, Ethan held a small charity event at his mansion. Guests from the business world came. Wealthy investors, political donors, media people all dressed in expensive clothes and fake smiles. Ethan introduced Grace to a few guests. Some were polite, some were clearly uncomfortable. One woman even mistook Grace for the waitress and asked her to bring more wine. Grace smiled, said nothing, and walked away quietly. Later that evening, Ethan found her sitting in the kitchen alone. "I shouldn't have asked you to come out there," he said gently. Grace looked at him. "I can handle ignorance. I just don't like how it makes you feel." Ethan sat beside her. "You deserve better." "I deserve honesty," she said. "If you want to build a life with me, we have to face these things, not hide from them." Ethan looked her in the eyes. "I'm not hiding. I'm ready. You by my side, not just in this house, in everything." Grace looked at him, unsure what to say. She had never been loved like that openly, bravely. She had spent her life staying quiet, not causing trouble, not drawing attention. But now, this man, this billionaire, was willing to fight for her. Tears filled her eyes. She leaned forward and hugged him tightly. The next morning, Ethan did something bold. He posted a picture on his company's official page, a picture of him, Grace and Jacob sitting on the garden bench, smiling. No long explanation, just a caption that read, "Family is not about blood. It's about love, trust, and healing." "I found mine." The internet exploded. Some people praised him. Others attacked him. Some made racist comments. Others called it beautiful. News outlets picked it up. Talk shows discussed it. It was everywhere. Ethan didn't respond to the hate. He didn't care. He only cared about the two people who mattered most, Jacob and Grace. That week, something beautiful happened. While playing with his blocks, Jacob looked up at Grace and whispered something. It wasn't loud or clear, but Ethan heard it too. "Mama?" Grace froze. Her hands trembled. She looked at Ethan, unsure if she had imagined it. Jacob said it again. This time, louder. "Mama." Grace fell to her knees and wrapped him in her arms, sobbing. Ethan joined them, holding them both in that moment. Nothing else mattered. Not money, not gossip, not fear, just love. The morning sun poured softly into the house through the wide glass windows. Everything looked golden and peaceful, like a warm hug wrapping around every corner of the home. But inside the mansion, something deeper had changed. Something one could see, but everyone could feel. It wasn't just a change in the way things looked. It was a change in the way hearts beat. Grace stood in the kitchen with Jacob in her arms, his small face resting gently against her shoulder. He had just called her mama for the first time. The word was soft, unsure, but it was real. Her heart had stopped for a second when she heard it. She had looked at Ethan with wide eyes, not sure if it was a dream, but Jacob said it again, and then again. Each time, a little stronger, a little clearer. Grace cried, not loudly, just quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks, full of joy, love, and something she hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. Ethan had come over and hugged them both tightly. He didn't speak either. He didn't need to. That moment spoke louder than any words. For the first time since Amanda had died, he felt like his family wasn't broken anymore. It wasn't the same. But maybe, just maybe, it had become something. Even more beautiful, that day, Grace didn't go back to her regular chores. Ethan insisted she rest, and she spent the afternoon with Jacob in the garden. They played with bubbles, watched butterflies, and sat in the grass making clumsy flower crowns. Ethan joined them later with lemonade and cookies. He didn't check his phone once. The man who had once been chained to his work had found something more important than meetings and emails. He had found peace. But even as everything felt more perfect than ever, Ethan knew he had something important to do. He had been holding a secret in his heart. For weeks, he had been thinking about the future, not just tomorrow or next year, but the kind of life he wanted to build for the rest of his days. And in every version of that future, Grace was there, not just as someone who lived in his house, not just as Jacob's caretaker, but as his partner, his love, his family. So a few days later, he made a plan. Ethan didn't want anything fancy, no big event, no camera flashes or diamond-studded stage. He wanted something honest, something that felt like them. So he did the one thing he never thought he would do again. He cooked. That Friday night, after Jacob went to bed early, Ethan asked Grace to come to the backyard. She walked outside to find the garden glowing with small fairy lights. The table was set under the big oak tree, with flowers and 2 plates of food. Grace stopped and smiled. "What's all this?" Ethan walked out of the shadows wearing an apron and holding a plate. "Dinner, made by me. No promises, it's edible." She laughed softly. "That's a risk I'm willing to take." They sat together, ate the slightly burnt pasta, and talked, not about deep things. Just about small, silly things, like how Ethan couldn't tell a potato from an apple once while cooking. Grace laughed until her stomach hurt. Ethan watched her, his heart full. After they finished eating, Ethan stood up, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box. Grace froze. "Grace," Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly, "I've been through so much. I've lost, I've grieved, and I've tried to live with that hole in my heart. But you didn't just help Jacob heal. You helped me heal too. You brought life back into this house. You taught me how to smile again, how to feel again." He opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, elegant but not flashy. "I don't care about what people say or how the world sees us. I care about you. I love you. Will you marry me?" Grace stared at the ring, then at him. Her eyes were wide, full of shock and emotion. She didn't speak at first. Her hands covered her mouth. "You don't have to answer now," Ethan said quickly, nervous. "I just wanted you to know how I feel." Grace shook her head slowly, tears in her eyes. "You fool," she whispered with a smile. "I would have said yes, even if you had asked me with a breadstick." Ethan laughed, relief washing over him. "So, that's a yes." Grace nodded, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They stood in the garden under the lights, holding each other, feeling like the rest of the world had disappeared. The next morning, when Jacob woke up, Ethan told him the news in the simplest way. "Grace is going to be part of our family forever." Jacob smiled and clapped his hands. Then he ran to Grace and hugged her tightly. No words were needed. The days that followed were filled with quiet joy. It was no grand wedding, just a small ceremony in the backyard with close friends, a few supportive staff, and of course, Jacob wearing a tiny bow tie and holding the rings. Grace wore a simple white dress, and Ethan wore a smile that never left his face. After the wedding, Ethan made another big decision. He stepped down from running his company full-time. He handed over control to a trusted team so he could focus on family. He didn't want to miss a single day. No more important meetings while Jacob grew up. No more hiding emotions behind work. He and Grace turned the mansion into a real home. They repainted rooms in soft colors, added toys and books to the living room, and built a sensory playroom for Jacob. They cooked together, played together, and even took weekend trips to the countryside. Everywhere they went as a family. One of the most beautiful moments happened 6 months later. Jacob was sitting in the backyard with Grace, arranging colored blocks. Ethan watched from the window, smiling. Suddenly, Jacob looked up and spoke clearly. "Love, Mama. Love, Daddy." Grace gasped, turning to him. Ethan came running outside. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "I did," Ethan said, kneeling beside him. "Say it again, buddy." Jacob looked at them both, smiled proudly, and repeated, "Love, Mama. Love, Daddy." They didn't know where he had learned to say those exact words or how he'd practiced them. But they didn't care. They pulled him into their arms and held him for a long time. That night, after Jacob fell asleep, Ethan and Grace sat on the couch, holding hands. "You know," Ethan said, "some people said we didn't belong together, that you didn't belong in this world." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "I didn't belong in their world, but I think I was always meant to be in yours." He kissed her forehead gently. "You didn't just fit into my world, you made it better." And he was right. Grace didn't come with fancy degrees or a powerful last name. She came with strength, patience, and a heart full of love. She didn't wear designer clothes or live in a big house before, but she brought more warmth to Ethan's mansion than all the expensive things ever had. She didn't raise her voice to be noticed. She simply loved quietly, deeply. And that love changed lives. In the end, it didn't matter where she came from. It only mattered that she came into their lives and stayed. And as they sat together in that once empty house, now full of laughter, books, toys, and memories, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He hadn't just fallen in love with a maid. He had found a partner, a mother for his child, a healer for his heart, and a forever home.